Welcome to Parenting Teens, the podcast where we navigate the ups and downs of raising teenagers. As founders of Ramp Nutritional Products for Teens, we're real parents going through the same challenges, and we bring on experts to offer unique insights and inspiration. Join our community and know you're not alone in your struggles. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Parenting Teens podcast. My name is Annie Salzberg, and as always, I am here today with my friend, colleague, co-business founder, Simone Irwin. As always, we enjoy bringing on specialists and experts in their field to the Parenting Teens podcast so we can share their wealth of experience and expertise with you, our community. Today, we are exploring mental health, and we're doing a deep dive into anxiety, which is a topic that I would venture guess is familiar to probably most people. And so to explore this topic today, I'm really thrilled to welcome Zia, or Dr. Zia Lakdawalla. Dr. Lakdawalla obtained her BA in psychology from McGill University, followed by a master's and PhD from the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's worked across various mental health settings, which include community mental health, private practice, day treatment programs, as well as hospitals. She is currently the director of Foundations for Emotional Wellness, where she maintains her own private practice. She conducts parenting groups and workshops and delivers talks and trainings on various mental health issues. And so we're so thrilled to have you here today, Zia, and explore this really important topic.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome.
So, as we usually do, we like to share a question from our community. So we're going to get into that. But I guess before we dive in, maybe we can take a few minutes to explore or just maybe talk about, because I know our question is going to center on anxiety. And I'm curious if, Simone and I were chatting a little bit before we started recording, or I even mentioned, anxiety can look like a lot of different things. And so how do you know if it's anxiety? Like, how do you know? How do you label something as anxiety, either for yourself or for your child? And I know that's a really broad question, but I'd love for you to kind of orient us or ground us in that word.
It's a really good question. So if we think about what the function, every emotion we have has a function that's related to it. And it's there for a good reason. We've needed it through evolution and all these sort of basic emotions. And if we think about anxiety in particular, the purpose and function of anxiety is to keep us safe, right? We get all these physiological indicators that are like your heart's racing, you're sweaty, you get racing thoughts. You need to do something to keep yourself safe. And along with that, there's like a behavioral response that goes along with the feeling in the body. And the hallmark of anxiety is really when there's some kind of an avoidance that our kids want to engage in. Either they don't want to go to school, or they don't want to try out a new extracurricular activity, or they go to a party and they're really quiet and they stay right beside a parent and they don't want to venture off into their own thing. When there's any sort of persistent avoidance of something, and you can see it sort of in a pattern. Sometimes there's off days and there's like a one-off thing where kids are struggling and they feel a little bit anxious about a particular situation because it's novel. Makes so much sense. But we're looking for sort of patterns in behavior where there's sort of like a string where you can see my kid avoids doing something. They rely on me to regulate themselves a little bit. And that's sort of how we try to identify it, right? We're looking for frequency, intensity, not sort of these sort of one-off kinds of things.
Got it. And in cases where there's not, I don't know if this is the right way of saying it, overt avoidance, if someone's white knuckling it through something, can that also be, again, I, with his permission, I've talked to our younger son about talking about him a little bit in the podcast, and he said it's okay. And sometimes he says, sometimes in school, I feel just not like myself.
Yeah.
And, he's muscling through it, for lack of a better word. And sometimes I know he just doesn't feel settled or grounded.
Yeah.
So that would also be, I guess,
we're
not avoiding, but we're feeling not quite okay.
Feeling not quite okay. And there's a spectrum of these things, right? Like we see kids who have diagnoses, they're consistent avoidance, and that's the end of the spectrum, right?
Sure.
And then we can see these kids who are actually really quite high functioning, and there's no clear impairment in their day-to-day because they go to school, they do their things, but there's a little bit of like a silent distress to what they experience. And for those kids, I think the interventions are a little bit different, right? For those kids, we don't want our kids to struggle or really suffer in any way a lot of the time. And there's great tools and strategies that we can give those kids to regulate themselves and to manage their anxiety. And I would say I just want to balance that with, if kids are doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, there's sort of like a natural exposure to some of the things that are stressful for them. And over time, that can get better the more they do those things.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I feel like Simona, you and I were chatting about that as well. This idea of not avoiding those things, just kind of continuing to do that exposure and being okay with that discomfort. Because I know as parents, and again, I think this is sort of part of the genesis of even our company and even this podcast. It's like it's really uncomfortable being a parent sometimes and seeing your child struggle, and it's
Mhm.
really painful and you just want to we're so habituated to band-aiding, like we want to fix it or
Totally.
whatever it is.
Totally.
Mhm.
And I think that's at like the essence of what emotion regulation is really about, is being able to sit with discomfort and getting better through new opportunities, new stressors, at being okay with our kids experiencing the discomfort, and also with us allowing them to experience it, which is so hard it's like the hardest thing to do, to see your kids distressed, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes, as we're going to talk maybe a little bit about with this parent that wrote into you, sometimes parents are pulled to do all kinds of things with the best of intentions and like all coming from a good, loving place, that sometimes may not be the best thing to do, especially when you're trying to work with a child who struggles with anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the stories that I was sharing with Annie before we hopped on was just we did one of your parenting classes, which was just so great. And my younger son was struggling with wanting to go to school and starting to feel like panicked on the walk to school and started to have all these physical symptoms. And his distress was, of course, distressing to me. And
Yeah.
through the coaching and through being like, okay, I know about this for my own anxiety and my own stuff. And I knew, we had to do this a certain way. But I remember, it was the tip over moment that was actually a huge win. But we were walking and then he was like, I can't breathe. I think my face is numb. Like, I have to go home. It's an emergency. And we sat, and it was both being with his discomfort, but then, the big thing was sitting with my
Yes.
discomfort and being like, I hear you. This is really hard. You do feel all these things. And, we can handle feeling these
Yeah.
things and we can do this. And he wrote it out. And 10 minutes later, he was like, actually, I think I'm going to go to school now.
Wow.
Amazing. Good job. Right.
Yeah, so it was really, yeah, it was a big win, but I know it in myself and my kids. And I mean, so many people that we speak to are struggling with this. So it's a good segue into
Yeah.
our question, maybe.
If I can
Oh,
just
sorry,
add
go ahead.
something related to what you said, Simona, I
Mhm.
think sometimes, we talk about what the function of anxiety is and when you really need it. And there's a good side to it. Our kids study for tests. They look both ways before crossing the street. They should have their, alarm their like, their guard up when they're in certain situations. That's the good side of anxiety. And sometimes when our kids get too anxious, they start signaling distress to a parent. And that's sort of the interpersonal nature of anxiety. And that's our job as parents. We respond to our kids, from the time they're infants, we respond to distress. They cry, we feed them, right? When they cry, we change their diaper. But kids who are anxious, they signal more distress more frequently to a parent. And so it's sort of on us to think about, is there actually real danger for my child in this environment? Or is this something that, because maybe they come by it honestly, you're an anxious parent, I sure am. So that's where my kids get it from. Maybe they come by this honestly and they're just sort of like signaling distress. But we have to think about, like, what are we responding to? If there's real danger, for sure, we want to like get on board, support the avoidance, fight or flight kicks in. Good job, parents. But if there isn't real danger in the environment, sometimes we do things that actually collude with their thinking that something actually is dangerous.
Mm.
And that's
I
the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Mhm.
but I think that's such a fine line to
It
walk
is.
because there's so
Mhm.
many layers of it. Is this my I mean, I guess we can swear out, is this our own podcast? Is this my shit? Is this their shit? Like, whose shit is this? And what is the object, and this is probably actually a good segue, because I feel like the question from this parent probably will give us some more stuff to talk about. So I don't know, Simona, do you want to share the question from the parent that came in?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll also just say too, as part of the segue, another piece that we were talking about was this difference between, when our kids are little and we can be like, we have a bit more say in where they go and showing up. And then when you have a teen, and the teen can kind of just like put their heels in and
oh my
say
God,
no.
You can't pick them up. You literally have no recourse. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this parent is saying, my 13-year-old has always been a bit anxious, but things have recently escalated, and we find ourselves turning our lives upside down to make sure she feels safe. For example, she texts me and calls me from school at least 6 to 7 times to check in. And I want to be there for her, but I also need to get my own work done. What can I do? Help.
Right. Should we just dig in, and I'll
sure. Yeah, I would love your thoughts on that.
Okay. So I think this gets to that idea of, is my 13-year-old in danger? She's at school. She's in an environment with teachers, with adults that are looking after her. And this is that sort of fine line that you're saying, Annie, around how do we navigate this kind of thing? And sometimes anxiety is contagious. We see our kids distress. It triggers all of our shit. We get anxious, and that sort of dysregulation starts to flow both ways. And, before we go into like what's helpful, I think parents are like, I truly think parents are doing the best they can. And when you have a child who's anxious, our go-to is to really try to support, fix, alleviate, get them to a place where they can actually not feel as dysregulated. But when it comes to anxiety in particular, sometimes some of those things we call them, in our world, we call them accommodations. And an accommodation is something that parents do specifically with the goal of reducing anxiety in their child. So lots of examples of accommodation might look like, providing excessive reassurance. You're going to be okay. You've got this. You can go to school. You can do this. Lots of airtime and lots of reassurance around what they're presenting with. Sometimes kids actually solicit a lot of it. Do you think it's going to be okay? Who's going to be there? What's going to happen? Answering a lot of questions. Other kind, just to give you some flavor of what accommodations look like. Other things could be, getting to places extra early, so that you make sure you're not late, you're not the last one in. What else? Not going certain places, loud places where your kids tend to get anxious, avoiding birthday parties, staying with your kids at birthday parties. So if we think about this parent who wrote in, we can sort of frame answering the phone calls over and over again as an accommodation, right? And that's how the cycle of anxiety tends to maintain itself. So your child presents with some kind of distress. I don't know, maybe she gets a thought at school, something's wrong. I want to know where mom is. I just want to check in. She calls, right? When she calls, when the parent answers, there's a short-term down regulation and anxiety. I feel better. Okay, I heard from her. I feel okay. Everything's good, right? And that's the reward. That's why kids do it. And that's why parents do it too, because you do get a short-term little reward in there, right? You feel like you helped for a moment. And then in the long term, that child now has a continued dependence on the parent for their regulation. So the next time she just feels a little bit discomfort in her body, she has the urge to reach out, she's going to. And that's how the cycle of the anxiety tends to maintain itself. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's and I don't mean to say that it's dark, because that sounds quite judgy, but it's quite sneaky, because, as you said, the parent provides that relief. I mean, I know I've been on the receiving end of these texts, like, this class sucks. I don't understand what's happening, or, I'm not going to do the work, or I don't understand I'm just like, what do you want me to do? But I get baited.
Yep.
And I engage. And then, but I find, as the kids get older, it's like disguised as like I'm in connection with him. Like
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
wants me, he needs me. And it like,
Mm.
that's dark. Like it's a dark way to connect, right? It's sort of like, it's like something like throw me a bone. Like I'll take it, even if it's anxiety. I'll
Yes.
like, I want, because I don't feel you, because now you are separating from me and
How
leaving. And
hard.
so like, if all you'll give me is your complaints, I'll take it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yes. Yeah. And like sometimes I think there's a difference between connection and validation,
Mhm.
right? And then the things that we're doing to actually maintain this interpersonal cycle of anxiety that flows between parent and child. So I think the first part is really critical. I see you. You're anxious. You've got like something's up. That makes so much sense given who you are or who the teacher is or what that class is like for you. So that validation and connection piece, we never want to get rid of that. That's like at the foundation of everything we do as parents and for parenting in general. And we also want to instill confidence in our kids that they've got this, right? That they can actually, we want to reflect back that they have the skills, we believe in them, we know that they can handle hard things. And when we do the other thing where we accommodate, we're not really communicating that very clearly, right? So there is a subtle difference between saying, I see you, I can tell you're really anxious about that thing, and I really think you can handle this,
Mhm.
right? We know that like one of the key things that differentiates kids from who have anxiety, who have high levels of anxiety, from kids who have the same level of anxiety but a diagnosis is just the confidence that they can do these things,
Mhm.
right? And as parents, if we consistently become that mirror that reflects back, I believe in you, I think you can do this. These are like the little drops in the bucket that over time they actually are going to lean on. If they think I can do it, I think I can do it too, actually. Right? It's
Mhm.
not a quick fix that happens in the moment. They're like, I can't do it. What are you talking about? I don't think I can do this. But in the long term, if that's your consistent reflection, that does pay off, I think.
Yeah, I think about my son, like with the school issue that I was in a group and discussing, and I think when I look back at it, it's like, he would have his distress moment, and then I would have my distress moment, and then I would actually be modeling, you can't do this,
Yeah.
because I'd be like, you're distressed. I'm distressed. Like, let's go home. Like, let's chill. Like,
Right.
let's like regulate. And I was thinking, oh, this is caring and connecting and good, but actually in those moments it was like I was the first, like I was like made the decision that we would go
Yeah.
back home,
Yeah.
and I modeled like we can't handle this, or like I'm scared, actually there is something serious here, you're
Yeah.
going to explode if you go, or whatever it is, because that in the nervous system it's like it feels so serious. But
Yes.
then later when we went through it, it was like, oh, if I just show that I'm willing to sit here in this total discomfort and
Mhm.
dysregulation, and then just wait it out and hold hands, and it's like, yeah, we're just going to sit here, and we are going today, and this is, what's going to happen, and you've got this. And it it was so fascinating, because I do remember him kind of like looking at this new response, and it was like he learned it pretty quickly,
Yeah.
surprisingly.
Yeah. They're really responsive to how
Mhm.
you respond to them, right?
Yeah.
I think that the two different things that you mentioned. So on the one hand, you know, so if you think about how the anxiety, sort of the shape of the anxiety, it peaks at a certain point and it comes back down. All emotions really function that way, right? Something happens, they escalate, we feel extreme discomfort at the peak, and then if we can just get over that hump and ride it out, it does eventually come down. And we know that like humans have to experience that full wave. You've got to go up and come down the other side. And what you did really beautifully when you sit with him on the sidewalk and he's in that peak state is you're just going to co regulate and ride it out with him. And you
Mhm.
just sit and wait till it comes down, as opposed to maybe previously at the peak there, you're sort of pulling the chute, right?
Yeah,
And that's
totally.
incredibly reinforcing for both of you. If we just go back home, we both feel better and all is good in the
Yeah.
short term, right? But then when you've got to go back to school the next day, it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I just want to like flag, and I feel like you said this really well earlier, but just I'm saying this for kind of like for myself and for any parent listening. And all parents are doing their best
Yes.
and sitting at the side, for 10 minutes, like we don't always have that time, right? There's like a time component here. There's like an urgency to most of our lives. And so doing this like co-regulation and coaching sometimes feels like this extra demand. And I appreciate that this is parenting. This is part and parcel of like
Yeah.
what we're meant to be doing. And yet, yeah, like I can relate. Like when, many, many years ago, going to a birthday party and our son like not wanting to engage and me saying like, then let's just leave.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to stand here in the doorway for 30 minutes when I have to be back here in an hour and 15 minutes. Like, this doesn't make any sense for me.
Right.
So it's like, we're out. Like, there's also this sort of, you're coming grocery shopping with me then. That's what I was going to do in this time, know? And I think that, I don't know why. I'm probably saying this mostly for me, but just to say like, it's so great when we have that space and time to do it. And I also want to just acknowledge that it's like we don't always have that. And it's really hard to also know that you're not showing up the way you want to show up for your kid.
Yeah. Well, and I think like, so two things. Firstly, it's a short-term versus long-term thing, right?
Yeah.
So in the short term, it is good to try to really be thinking about like, what am I reflecting back when I'm actually doing this thing? And if you have the time, the resource, the space to be able to dig in that way, that's ideal, right? Because then you're really investing in the long term of your child's regulation, relying on their own coping skills, less reliance on you. And life is really busy. We can't do that all the time. And sometimes it's okay if you're really committed to the process, a good portion of the time. And sometimes it's just like, I'm not out for this and you're not out for this and we're just going to bail. That's okay. We're just like, it's really just about like patterns of behavior and consistent messaging.
Yeah. No,
Right?
that's really helpful. It's true.
Yeah.
It's like, kind of very similar to what you were talking about both of you have talked about. I do remember hearing from one of our son's like earliest preschool teachers, just the way she framed it. Because again, this was a kid who's like holds back, doesn't necessarily always jump in, or not the first to jump in. And I just remember hearing her say to him, "It's okay to take your time to be sure."
Yeah.
And it was like such a night, and I kind of like held that, and I feel like I've used that like for the last 15 years. And it's just like, it really stuck. It was such a simple line that was just like affirming and validating and felt really clear that there's nothing wrong here. You're taking your time, and that's good for you, and that's fine. And you're going to get there.
Totally.
It was just so lovely. And I'm sure very common, but it was the first time I remember hearing it when my kid was little for the first time. And
it's so nice to
it was
hear
brilliant.
Like that, because we don't often reinforce that, right? What really gets reinforced in the world we live in is the kid who's outgoing, who's chatty with people, right? Like, at all of these like variables that kids who are anxious and quiet and like thoughtful and have all these amazing qualities, that doesn't get as reinforced, I think, as in society, right? So such a nice thing to hear as a young parent, for sure.
Yeah.
Can we just go back to this parent though?
Yes.
Hanging around like this.
Yeah, no, I was going to have a few more follow-up questions on the question, but yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So we sort of acknowledge that maybe some of what she's doing by answering every time is an accommodating behavior, and it's part of the cycle of reinforcing her anxiety, the child's anxiety, maybe even the mom's, right? So two things are important: to acknowledge that she's anxious. She has a kid who's probably struggling with some anxiety. And also to reflect back day to day, right? As just part of when anxiety comes up, I see it, right? These sort of supportive statements, we call them. And I believe in you. I know you can do this. And then it's good to come up with a really thoughtful plan, not impromptu in the moment, but ahead of time for what you're going to do about those phone calls. And, to pick one specific scenario that's coming up. In this case, the phone calls that are coming home, that are coming to the parent daily. And think about, if we're going to try to peel off some of that accommodation, how can we do this in a warm, connected way with our kids? And sometimes we have to do things a little bit without their consent because kids are not so motivated to change this behavior, right? When kids struggle with anxiety, they are looking for ways to alleviate themselves as quickly as possible, right? That's what the signal of distress is for. And that's where we come in a sturdy way around like, actually, no, you've got this, you can do this. but we've got to do it with some warmth and connection too. So a plan, something like sitting down with your daughter or like ahead of time the day before and saying something like, I've sort of learned about this and I've realized that when I answer your calls over and over, I'm not actually helping you to learn that you can do this. Right. And so from now on, I know that you're anxious and that makes sense. I believe you can do it. From now on, I'm going to answer a lunchtime phone call when you're not in class. And then I'll answer a call right after school. Right. So you can reach out to me twice. Those are the two that I will absolutely answer. But outside of that, I'm working and you're in school and we'll see each other in the evening kind of thing. Right. And then the hardest part, it's easy to say it. It's really hard to do in the moment when the phone calls come in. Then it really falls on the parent to try to be very consistent with that plan and to reflect back to their kids, you did it. I'm so proud of you. Even if the child calls 10 times one day and they only get an answer twice, they still did it. Right? You got through that day. I only answered twice and here we are, we're having dinner together and everybody's okay. Right? And the more consistent they are at doing that, the better the child's going to learn to rely on themselves and their own coping in those moments.
Yeah, I love that. And for our family, it's been so true that it's, maintaining that consistency. And of course, it doesn't, all go beautifully the first time. And, sometimes there's some anger or tears or fighting or you don't love me or you don't care about me.
That's the hardest part.
And when you just stick with it in that warm and caring, like genuine way, it really does change. And I want to give that hope for people, and because it's hard to stick it out through that. And so much of this too is that the parents' discomfort and the parents' capacity for dysregulation and emotion and holding that space. And so it's like kind of both sides need to do that work together so the parent can be like, yep, this is hard. And, we're going to keep doing this because ultimately it's going to be better for you.
Yep.
Yeah.
I also just really want to add that I love just that approach. Maybe it's very obvious, but just being very honest with your children.
Yeah.
I learned about this thing. This is what I'm going to do. I love you all the same, but these are the boundaries I'm creating around this. And I just think that's it just feels very intuitive to me and natural. And we're not trying to create a story that's not true. It's you're naming it, you're explaining it in a way that makes sense. That just has a general approach to parenting. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yes. Yeah. And I think your point around this is a boundary that I'm setting is a really critical one, because there's different types of interventions for anxiety for kids. This is a parent intervention to treat child anxiety, which there's some research suggests is just as effective as a child intervention, right? Because these are the environments that kids live in. Yeah. But that really is contingent upon parents really following through on what their plan is, right? And that's your boundary, and this is where, but also still holding the connection and warmth. The flip side of that, though, is for kids who are anxious, there's lots of things they can do too, right? This is a 13-year-old girl. If she does struggle with anxiety, there's CBT, and, the active ingredient of that intervention is really about exposures, right? If she could get better at resisting the urge and get reinforced for that to reach out to mom, that also will double down on these efforts. Right?
Yeah. I love that. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the classes that you have and that you run, and how people can find out more about you and more about these different ways of supporting themselves and their kids.
Yeah, so I do a little bit of a gift of the pandemic for me was I did a lot of, I worked with families and children and adolescents for a long time, but in the pandemic we just sort of got inundated with lots of parents really wanting a lot of support. And so I started running workshops and I started running more groups, and I just really loved it. And, I really became passionate about working with parents and doing a lot more early intervention and equipping them as early as we can to really set them up for success and their kids up for success. So I run a lot of parent anxiety groups. I also run some parent groups for children who struggle with emotion regulation and how parents can attend to emotion in the most effective ways for those kids. And then I have a couple clinicians that work with me. We see, the whole range. We see kids up to the age of about 24 that struggle with a variety of mental health concerns. And we do some kid groups as well, which are the most fun. If you have a child who struggles with anxiety, I actually think it's one of the best interventions to be with other kids and do some exposure work together. So, yeah.
That's great. And so if people wanted to read more about those groups or find the classes, is there a website or social handle that you'd want to direct people to?
Yeah, so the website is probably the best place, and you can contact us directly through there. It's www.ffew.ca.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I know we're getting really tight on time, but I do want to just slide in our standard question that we ask all of our guests. I feel like you alluded to children earlier, but what we typically ask our guests is if they have a tip or something that they use or to help foster connection in their own family, with their own children, if they're a healthcare professional with their children in their practice.
Yeah.
We're always trying to give very sort of action-oriented tips for parents, and we've gotten some great ideas over the episode. So would love to hear if you have any final tips for our community.
Yeah, I have 3 kids. So I have 12, 10, and 7.
Amazing.
And so I think about this stuff a lot because it's like sort of the foundation of what I do with families. I think I would say there's 2 things that are important. The first one is to play with your kids as much as you can. And play for a 12-year-old looks different from play with a 7-year-old, but time without a device, doing some kind of shared activity, and really self-assessing, can I reliably generate a laugh with my kid? Right? Can I generate a good feeling, a mutual good feeling between the two of us? So that's my first one. And then the second one would be to create traditions with your kids. Something that you do that happens with some regularity and frequency on a weekly basis, if you can, that kids come to remember and they come to rely on. I think if you guys think back to when you were kids, the things that we often remember are the things that we did over and over again with our families. We went to this cottage in the summer, or, on Saturday mornings, my mom made pancakes, and this is the thing that happened. So I think protecting time to create tradition and something that you do as a family together, you do with one child alone, whatever that is.
I love both of those suggestions. Thank you so much, Zia. It was so helpful to hear your words of wisdom and to give us a greater understanding of anxiety. We encourage everyone in our community to go check out your work, and we really thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Parenting Teens. We hope you found today's episode informative and helpful. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you want to dive deep into teen-related resources, visit our website at drinkramp.com. Do you have a teen-related question? Drop it on SpeakPipe at speakpipe.com/parenting teens. As always, we're here to support you on your parenting journey. Until next time.